Today we're going to tell a story from more than 2,500 years ago. A story of an old man who went to the master Confucius in search of answers to a dilemma that many face in old age. His name was Li Wei, a man who had spent his entire life devoted to his children, believing that when he got older, he would have a special place by their side. When he moved in with his family, he thought he would finally find peace and companionship, but over time he realized that the closer he got, the lonelier he felt. His children were always busy, the grandchildren distracted, and the conversations that used to flow naturally became short and hurried. The house was full, but his heart had never been so empty. Unable to understand why his presence seemed to weigh him down instead of being welcomed, Li Wei decided to seek help. He heard about Confucius, the master of wisdom, and with hope in his heart, set off for the temple where the sage taught. When he arrived, he found Confucius sitting under the shade of a cherry tree, surrounded by attentive disciples. The old man approached, bowed respectfully, and said, "Master, I have spent my life looking after my children. Now that I'm old, I thought that by living close to them, I would find love and belonging, but instead I feel invisible." Confucius watched the man for a moment and replied calmly, "When you see a wise man, think of matching his virtue. When you see a man without virtue, examine yourself." From that moment on, the master's words would forever change the way Li Wei saw his life, and they could change yours too. Confucius remained silent for a moment, watching the old man in front of him. Li Wei looked tired, but it wasn't just the weight of age that bowed his shoulders. There was something deeper, a silent pain, the feeling of having done everything, right and yet being lost. The master raised his eyes to the sky and then turned to the old man. "Li Wei, why do you believe that your closeness to your children would guarantee your place in their hearts?" The elder frowned, surprised by the question. "Master, I've spent my whole life working so that my children would have a better future. I gave up my own desires to see them grow up safely. Now that I'm old, all I want is to be around, to share moments, to feel part of the family I've built. But instead, I realize that my presence has become a detail, something secondary. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Isn't it the duty of children to look after their parents in old age?" Confucius listened attentively, his expression remaining serene. Then he pointed to a vase of water next to him. "If you fill this vase to the brim and try to carry it, what happens?" Li Wei hesitated for a moment before answering. "The water overflows." The master nodded. "So too are human relationships. When we try to put ourselves beyond the space that is ours, we create an imbalance. You built a home for your children, but now you want to be the center of it, even when they already have their own lives." Li Wei bowed his head. "So, master, what should I have done?" Confucius looked at the trees in the garden and replied, "Nature teaches us a simple truth. The river never returns to its source, but follows its course towards the ocean. It's the same with children. You raised them to follow their own paths. Now they must follow yours." The old man felt a tightness in his chest. For years he had believed that old age would be a return to the family, a time of giving back and welcoming. But now he was beginning to realize that expecting his children to fill his emptiness could be a mistake. Confucius continued, "Li Wei, love and respect cannot be demanded, only cultivated. The more you try to keep yourself at the center of your children's lives, the more they feel your presence as a burden. True love is born of freedom, not obligation." The old man remained silent. He felt as if a blindfold had been removed from his eyes. He realized that as much as he loved his children, he had forgotten something essential. He also needed to live for himself. Finally, he looked up at Confucius and asked, "And what do I do now, master? How do I find my way?" The sage smiled gently and replied, "The journey is not over yet, Li Wei. Now you must learn what it means to grow old wisely. He who commands respect will be respected. He who cultivates virtue will be followed." At that moment, the old man understood that his search for belonging didn't end with his children. He needed to find his own purpose, and it was there, under the guidance of the great teacher, that his true journey began. The temple garden was serene. The wind gently swayed the leaves of the trees while Li Wei remained silent, reflecting on the words of Confucius. The master watched him, sensing the elder's internal struggle. After a moment, he pointed to two trees growing side by side in the courtyard, their branches intertwined chaotically, vying for space in the sunlight. "Tell me, Li Wei," said Confucius, "what happens when two trees grow too close together?" Li Wei looked at the trees and reflected for a moment before answering. "Their branches become entangled. They compete for space, for light." Confucius nodded. "Does that make them stronger or more fragile?" The elder frowned, hesitated, but then sighed. "More fragile, master. They don't grow freely. Their branches twist, fighting for a place in the sun." Confucius smiled slightly. "That's life too, Li Wei. We often believe that closeness means unity, but in fact, it can generate tension. Respect and love cannot be imposed, only cultivated. When we try to force ourselves into other people's routines, we can end up suffocating rather than strengthening bonds." The old man remained silent. He remembered his arrival at his eldest son's house. At first, everything seemed perfect. There were family dinners, lively conversations, the sweet illusion that he was finally part of that new phase in his children's lives. But over time, he realized that his presence was no longer a special event, but a detail that had been overlooked. He noticed the impatient looks when he asked too many questions, the smiles that seemed obligatory, the uncomfortable silence when he talked about his own feelings. His children's routine was different from his own. They were always busy, immersed in their commitments, while he had plenty of time. What for him was a need for connection, for them was an added responsibility. "But master," Li Wei raised his voice in anguish, "I am their father. Isn't it natural for a son to want to be close to his father?" Confucius looked at him with compassion. "Li Wei, what happens when you hold a handful of sand in your hand and squeeze it hard?" The elder frowned. "It slips through your fingers." "Exactly. It's the same with human bonds. Love and respect don't flourish under pressure. The more you demand closeness, the more distant people tend to feel." Li Wei bowed his head. He didn't want to be a burden, but all he wanted was to feel part of the lives of those he loved. Confucius noticed his sadness and put his hand on his shoulder. "The problem, Li Wei, is not that your children don't love you. The problem is that you expect their love to be shown in the way you want, but each person expresses affection in a different way." Li Wei looked up. "So what should I do?" Confucius smiled and pointed to the river that ran past the temple. "The river doesn't try to hold back the water that passes through it. It just flows. If you want your children to respect you, stop trying to hold on to them. Give them space to miss you, and you'll see that respect and affection will come naturally." At that moment, Li Wei began to understand that true love is not about being physically present all the time, but about knowing when to give space. And with that lesson, his view of old age began to change. Silence weighed on Li Wei. The words of Confucius still echoed in his mind. Physical closeness does not mean closeness of heart. He knew it was true, but accepting it was another matter. After a moment's reflection, Li Wei took a deep breath and asked, "Master, I've spent my whole life looking after my children, making sacrifices so that they would have a better future. Now that I'm old, isn't it fair to expect them to do the same for me?" Confucius looked at him patiently and replied gently, "The superior man blames himself, the common man blames others. Li Wei, when you plant a tree, do you do it expecting it to give you shade in your old age?" The old man frowned. "No, master. I plant it because I know that the tree must grow freely, follow its own course." Confucius nodded. "That's right. So why did you expect your children to be any different? You raised them to follow their own paths, but now you want them to interrupt their journeys to revolve around you. True love is not a debt that needs to be repaid." Li Wei bowed his head. He had never thought of it like that. He had spent years believing that his effort and dedication would be rewarded in old age, but now he realized that perhaps this expectation was too heavy a burden for his children. "But master," he murmured, "how can I accept this? How can I stop waiting?" Confucius smiled slightly and pointed to a bird perched on a nearby branch. "Look at that bird. It was fed by its mother when it was small. But one day, she pushed it out of the nest, and off he flew. Now he builds his own nest, feeds his own chicks. If his mother tried to trap him, hoping he would never leave her side, what would happen? Li Wei sighed. He would feel suffocated. That's right. The biggest mistake parents make in old age is not loving their children too much, but expecting them to reciprocate that love in the way they want. If love has to be collected, then it becomes an obligation rather than a genuine feeling. The old man was silent for a long time. He remembered when his children were young and everything he had done for them. Now he realized that, without realizing it, he had hoped that his old age would be a reflection of his youth, as if the cycle of life could be reversed. But that wasn't possible. Time only moves forward. So, Master, what should I do now? Confucius looked at the horizon and replied, "It is easier to light a candle than to curse the darkness," said the Master. "Find joy in what you can control. Live your life not as a burden to others, but as an example of wisdom and independence. That way, respect and affection will come naturally." Li Wei felt something different inside. The pain of expectation was still there, but now it was accompanied by understanding. He was finally beginning to accept that his children were not responsible for his happiness. This journey was his alone. Confucius walked slowly through the temple garden, while Li Wei followed him in silence, lost in his own thoughts. With each step, the old man felt the pain of expectation turn into an emptiness that was hard to accept. "Master," he murmured, "if I can't expect my children to look after me, then what is my place? If closeness doesn't strengthen bonds, what should I have done?" Confucius stopped in front of a small lake and looked at the clear water reflecting the sky. "Li Wei, have you ever held water in your hands?" The elder frowned, not understanding. "Yes, Master, if you're not careful it will slip through your fingers." Confucius nodded. "And the more you try to hold it, the faster it gets lost. It's the same with love and respect. The more you try to hold on to them, the more they slip through your fingers." Li Wei looked away, reflecting. He remembered his arrival at his children's house. At first, he was greeted with joy, but as time went by, he began to notice small signs of impatience. Conversations became rushed. Moments together began to feel like compromises. His children still respected him, but there was no more spontaneity. "Master, my children haven't stopped loving me, but why, even without words, do I feel that my presence has become a burden?" Confucius smiled gently. "Because you taught them to fly, but now you cling to their wings so you don't fall." The elder felt a tightness in his chest. "But I just wanted to be part of their lives." The wise man interrupted him gently. "And that's the problem. Children's love for their parents is natural, but it can't be demanded, nor can it be sustained by guilt. Their presence reminds them that they can't always be by their side, that they have their own families, their own responsibilities. This creates an invisible weight that frays bonds." Li Wei nodded, feeling exposed. He didn't want to be a burden, but without realizing it, he had placed an emotional load on his children. He wanted closeness, but ended up creating a silent barrier. "So, Master, what should I do?" Confucius looked back at the lake and answered calmly, "The river never tries to hold back the water that passes through it. It just flows, allowing the water to come and go. If you want to be respected, stop trying to hold on to your children's routine. Give them space to miss you, and you'll see that affection will come naturally." Li Wei closed his eyes for a moment. For the first time, he understood that true love is not about always being there, but knowing when to let go. He still didn't know exactly how he would do this, but he knew he needed to change. And with that lesson, his journey to find a new purpose began to take shape. The wind blew gently through the temple garden, and Li Wei walked beside Confucius, still digesting his master's words. He had understood that physical proximity did not guarantee emotional connection, that expecting retribution from one's children was a mistake, and that their constant presence could generate guilt instead of affection. But one question remained, unanswered. If he shouldn't depend on his children, then what should his path be? "Master," Li Wei broke the silence, "I spent my entire life devoted to my family. My days revolved around raising them, supporting them, and guiding them. Now, without that role, I feel I've become useless. If I'm not here to look after my children, what am I good for? Confucius stopped in front of a solitary tree in the garden and pointed to it. Look at that tree, Li Wei. Before, it was a small, fragile seed. It needed care to grow. But the day came when its roots took hold, and it no longer needed anyone to support it. The old man watched the tree in silence, reflecting on the metaphor. But, Master, the branches of this tree still offer shade and shelter. It is still useful to those who pass by. Confucius smiled. Yes, but it doesn't force anyone to take shelter under its shade. It just exists, and those who need rest naturally seek it out. Li Wei felt a tightness in his chest. All his life, he had believed that his identity was linked to caring for his children, but now he realized that he could continue to exist without having to be at the center of their lives. The problem, Li Wei, isn't that you've run out of purpose. It's that you've never learned to live for yourself. You've always lived for others, and now you have to ask yourself, who are you apart from a father? The question echoed inside him. He had never thought about it before. What made him happy? What gave him pleasure apart from his family? But Master, what can an old man do to find a new purpose? When the goal seems distant, don't adjust the goal, adjust the steps, said the Master. Confucius took a handful of seeds and handed them to the old man. You can plant, you can teach, you can learn. Old age is not a time of waiting, but a time of discovery. As long as there is life, there is something to explore. Li Wei closed his hand over the seeds and felt something different. For the first time, he understood that he didn't have to depend on his children to feel that his life had value. From that moment on, he decided that he would find a new purpose, one that wasn't tied to the expectations of the past, but to what he could still build. And so his journey to true independence began. Li Wei held the seeds that Confucius had given him, feeling the symbolic weight of that gesture. His children had gone their separate ways, but he was still there. His life was not over. In the days that followed, the old man remained in the temple, reflecting on everything the Master had taught him. Little by little, he began to realize that the sadness he felt didn't just come from being away from his children, but from the fact that for a long time he didn't know who he was without them. One morning, while walking around the temple, he came across a young disciple who was trying to build a small vegetable garden. The young man was frustrated because the seedlings weren't growing as he had hoped. "You're doing the watering wrong," said Li Wei, observing the soggy soil. "If you give it too much water, the roots won't have room to grow and strengthen." The young man looked at him curiously. "How do you know that?" Li Wei smiled slightly. "I spent my youth working in the fields. I learned that too much care can suffocate just as much as too little." The disciple nodded, absorbing the elder's words, and then asked, "Could you teach me?" Li Wei hesitated. How long had it been since he had passed on any knowledge other than to his children? For years he had believed that his role in life was exclusively linked to his family. Now he saw that he still had something to offer the world, even outside the role of father. He began to help the young man with the vegetable garden, and before long, other disciples began to seek his guidance. A few weeks later, they were already calling him Master Li Wei in respect for his experience. It was then that he realized something important. The less he expected recognition, the more he was valued. Before, when he lived for his children, he tried to impose his presence. Now he just existed, and those who needed his wisdom came to him naturally. Days at the temple became different. Li Wei began to wake up with purpose. He taught his disciples about the earth, about harvest time, about patience and balance. He began to read, to learn new things. He felt joy in his own routine without depending on anyone else to fill it. Then something unexpected happened. One day, while he was tending his plants, a young monk approached him and handed him a letter. It was from his eldest son. "Dad, I haven't seen you for a long time. I miss you. The grandchildren ask about you. We'd like you to come and visit us." Li Wei closed his eyes and smiled. When he stopped waiting for his children's love, it came naturally to him. For the first time, he felt truly free. Not because he had moved away from his family, but because he had learned to live for himself. And in that instant, he understood what Confucius had been trying to teach him all along. Respect and love come when they are not demanded, but cultivated lightly. His son's invitation to visit them brought a new feeling to Li Wei. Before, he would have rushed to the family home, full of hope and expectation. But now, after weeks in the Confucian temple, he no longer felt that anxiety about being accepted or proving his worth to his children. He was happy with his own life. His days had meaning. He taught his disciples about the land, planted his own seedlings, and spent his evenings reflecting on what he had learned over the years. Now he didn't see the visit as a necessity, but rather as a meeting without obligation, something that would happen naturally. Calmly, he organized his few things and set off for the family home. This time he wasn't going as a man in need of attention, but as someone who knew who he was, regardless of his children's love. When he arrived, he noticed some differences. His son welcomed him with a genuine smile, not a hurried one. His grandchildren, who had previously seemed distant, ran up to him and hugged him happily. Dinner was light, without the tension of silent obligations. "Dad, we were worried. You left so suddenly." "But you look well," said his eldest son, watching him. Li Wei smiled. "I am. I've found my own way. I've learned that old age doesn't have to be a time of waiting or dependence. It can be a time of discovery, of learning, of lightness." His son nodded. For the first time, he seemed to understand something he had never realized before. His father wasn't there out of necessity, but by choice. In the days he spent with the family, Li Wei noticed that something had changed. Before, he felt that his children welcomed him out of obligation. Now he was there because he was wanted, because his presence was appreciated and not demanded. On the morning of his departure, his son asked, "When will you come back to visit us?" Li Wei smiled and replied, "When the time is right." And so he made his way back to the temple, without haste, without sadness, with a light heart. He no longer needed to be there all the time to be remembered fondly. He was no longer a burden, but a presence that was missed. And finally, he understood. Confucius' most important teaching: the strongest ties are not those bound by obligation, but those that exist with freedom. Li Wei's story teaches us a truth that many are slow to realize. Love and respect cannot be demanded, only cultivated. Many parents reach old age believing that physical proximity to their children will guarantee affection and attention. However, as Confucius taught Li Wei, the more we try to hold on to others, the more we become a burden instead of a desired presence. Li Wei underwent a profound transformation. He understood that his happiness should not depend on his children, but on his own journey. When he stopped seeking forced recognition and acceptance, he found something even more valuable: the freedom to live for himself. And in the end, something curious happened. When he stopped demanding his children's presence, he became more valued by them. Respect and love returned naturally, without the guilt or obligation that had previously weighed on the relationship. Confucius' greatest teaching is clear. The strongest bonds are not those maintained by demand, but those that survive freedom. If there's anything we can learn from Li Wei, it's that old age doesn't have to be a time of waiting or regretting, but a time of rebirth and rediscovery. The question that remains is, are you living for yourself or just waiting for others to fill the void that only you can fill? If you've made it this far, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. I move on, and thank you. If this reflection made sense to you, like the video, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to receive more stories and reflections like this one. That way, you won't miss out on any new content. Take care, and see you next time.